Merle Ashcraft had been leaning on the same fence rail at the Pike County Livestock Exchange in Bowling Green, Missouri, for going on 19 years, and he said later that in all that time he had never once seen what he saw on the second Friday of November 2009. He said he almost didn't mention it when it happened. He thought maybe he'd misread the room. But he hadn't misread anything. He'd watched a 16-year-old boy in a gray hooded sweatshirt walk out of that barn with a ticket on 96 calves. And he'd watched every grown man in the place let him do it. And he said some mornings, when he was running his own cattle, he still thought about it. Merle Ashcraft was not a man who exaggerated. He'd been buying and selling stockers out of Pike County since 1990. He kept a pocket notebook, paid cash, and did not talk during the bidding. That morning he had come in looking at a pen of 60-day weaned Angus cross steers in the middle of the run. Good calves. Clean and even. The kind you could put on fescue and mostly forget about until spring. He was not looking at lot 22, which was the 90 head penned in the far corner behind a plywood partition with a yellow caution card zip tied to the gate. The caution card meant the barn manager had flagged the lot for health concerns. Not a quarantine, just a flag. It was the kind of thing that cleared a pen faster than a locked gate would have. The 90 calves had come down from a backgrounding yard in Lewis County. They had shipped on a Wednesday, arrived Thursday, and by Friday morning a fair number of them were coughing. The wet, loose cough that anybody who'd been around cattle for more than a season knew on sight. Some had discharge. A few were standing apart from the others and not eating. Roy Fenner, who moved more stocker cattle out of that barn than any other single buyer, and who had strong opinions about most things involving livestock, walked past the pen at about 8:40 that morning, put one hand on the gate rail, looked at the animals for maybe 6 seconds, and then said to nobody in particular, "Ho pen's done." He said it the way a man says something he considers settled and not worth discussing further. There's something about a person who doesn't have to prove anything. If you know what I mean, you already know why this story is worth your time. Hit subscribe and stay with us. Bowling Green sits at the northern end of Pike County, Missouri, in a stretch of country that is mostly cropland and mixed cattle pasture, rolling and treeless along the ridgetops, with timbered creek draws cutting down between the farms. November there is gray and cold and smells like turned ground and distant wood smoke. The Pike County Livestock Exchange ran its Friday sale year-round, and on a good week it would move 300 to 500 head through the ring. That Friday they had 412 head on the docket. The crowd was maybe 60 buyers, most of them regulars who had been coming to that barn long enough to have a usual spot to stand, plus the farmers who had brought cattle in and stayed to watch their lots come through. The boy came in just after the sale started, alone. His name was Harlan Goss. His family ran a small cow-calf operation on 110 acres, about 9 miles east of Bowling Green, on ground his grandfather had bought in 1962. And that his father now worked alongside a full-time job at a grain elevator. Harlan had been coming to this barn since he was old enough to stand at the rail without being told to move. He knew most of the regulars by face. He had never bought anything here himself. That morning, he had $410 in his wallet, money he had earned over the summer cutting grass and doing odd work for neighbors, and he had arranged with his father to borrow up to $4, $500 more if he found something that made sense. His father had not been able to come. He was working a shift at the elevator that he'd picked up because money had been tight since August, when a hydraulic repair on the family's John Deere 4440 had cost $1,340. They didn't have easy. So Harlan came by himself. He went straight to the far corner. He did not stop at the good pens, did not look at the Angus cross steers that Merle Ashcraft was already circling back to for a second look. He went directly to the yellow caution card and stood at the gate of lot 22, and looked at the 90 calves for a long time without moving. He had a small yellow legal pad folded in half and stuffed in his back pocket, and after a while he pulled it out and started writing things down. Merle Ashcraft, who had glanced over twice and was beginning to get genuinely curious, said later that the boy was not moving fast, not reacting to anything. He was looking at one calf at a time, going down the pen slow and steady, writing the way a careful man checks a piece of used equipment before he decides whether to make an offer. Roy Fenner noticed him too at some point. Fenner said later, and he said it without any particular meanness, just as a report of what he had believed at the time, that he figured the kid was a farmer's son who had wandered to the back out of boredom or curiosity. He said it did not cross his mind that the boy was there to buy. It should have. What Harlan Goss knew about sick calves came from his great-uncle, a man named Cecil Pruitt, who had died 8 months earlier in the first week of March 2009. Cecil had lived 11 miles from the Goss farm on 60 acres he'd mostly rented out for the last decade of his life. And before that he had backgrounded calves and run small stocker operations on and off since the early 1970s. He was not a notable man in any public way. He hadn't won awards or been written up in a farm magazine. He had just worked cattle for a long time and paid close attention, and when Harlan was 13, Cecil had started letting him come over in the mornings to watch and help. Cecil talked while he worked. That was the thing Harlan remembered most clearly afterward, that Cecil didn't lecture, didn't sit down and explain things formally, just talked while his hands were busy doing something else. He'd talk about what he was seeing in an animal, what it meant, what he was deciding, and why. Harlan listened and eventually started asking questions, and Cecil answered them plainly, without making the boy feel like the questions were foolish. Cecil had lost calves to bovine respiratory disease twice in his years backgrounding cattle. The first time it came through, early in his operation, he lost 11 out of 34 head, and it nearly finished him financially. The second time, about 15 years later, he lost 2 out of 41. The difference between those two outcomes was not luck, he told Harlan. It was knowing what you were looking at when you bought the animals, and knowing what to do in the first 72 hours after they arrived. He was specific about what to look for at the pen. Eyes, still clear or beginning to go sunken and dull. Stance, still square on all 4 feet, or starting to drop at the hip and stand wide. Ears, up and tracking or hanging. Movement through the pen, were they still walking around, still jostling each other a little, or were they planted in one spot and not shifting? And the cough itself. A wet, working cough was not automatically a death sentence. It meant the animal was still fighting. A cough that had gone silent in a pen that should be coughing, that was the thing to worry about. He told Harlan one other thing that the boy wrote down that same afternoon when he got home. The crowd reads the flag on the gate. You read the calves. Cecil left Harlan a set of handwritten notes when he died, not bound notebooks, more like 60 index cards held together with a wide rubber band, with observations about cattle health, treatment timing, and weight gain written in a cramped hand that was hard to read in low light. Harlan had gone through them twice in the months after Cecil died. He had them in his truck that morning. At the Pike County barn that Friday, Harlan spent 41 minutes at the gate of Lot 22 before the lot came up in the ring. 41 minutes. He went through the 90 head the way Cecil had taught him. Slow, one at a time, eyes first, then stance, then movement, then the cough. He was building a count. He started at the left side of the pen and worked right. The first calf he looked at was a black steer, maybe 550, coughing every 30 seconds or so with a wet, productive sound. Eyes clear. Ears up and tracking, standing square. Harlan made a mark in the left column of his legal pad, which meant early. The second calf, a red motley heifer standing close to the fence, had her head lowered slightly and a thin string of discharge on her left nostril. He watched her for 90 seconds. She shifted her weight twice. She was not planted. Left column. The third calf was standing in the back corner with his hip dropped and his ears flat and not moving when the animals around him moved. That one went in the right column. He wasn't sure about it. He put a small circle next to the mark. He worked like that for the better part of 40 minutes. The pen was loud enough. 90 sick calves coughing, some of them bunching and separating. The barn noise coming through from the ringside, that he had to concentrate to hear individual animals. At one point, a barn hand came through the alley behind him and looked at him, but didn't say anything. Harlan didn't look up. Of the 90 calves, he believed the clear majority were in the early stage of bovine respiratory disease. Bird, sick enough to flag the pen, not far enough gone to be lost. He counted 10 that he was less certain about. He wrote the number down, looked at those 10 again, changed his estimate to 8, and put a question mark next to it. He had done the math before he ever walked into that barn. If he bought 90 head at around 530 pounds each and lost 10 of them, he still had 80 calves recovering and gaining at the going stocker rate through winter. At the right purchase price, losing 10 was survivable. Losing 20 still worked, thinly. The question was whether he could get the lot cheap enough for the math to hold. He thought he could. When lot 22 came up, the auctioneer opened at 30 cents a pound. The ring was quiet in the specific way a ring gets quiet when nobody is pretending to consider something. He tried 25. Nothing. 20 cents. One man raised his hand slightly, looked at the calves one more time, and put his hand down. Roy Fenner, who had moved to the far side of the ring, made a small sound that was not a bid and glanced at his phone. The auctioneer went to 15 cents. A man near the back wall bid that, not enthusiastically. Harlan raised his legal pad. He bid 7 cents a pound. The room did something that was not quite laughter and not quite silence, more like a hesitation, the collective pause of 60 people recalculating what they were looking at. The auctioneer looked at him directly for the first time. Harlan looked back and did not say anything. Merle Ashcraft had stopped writing in his own notebook. He said later that the thing that struck him in that moment was that the boy was not nervous. He wasn't performing anything. He just wanted to buy the cattle. The man at 15 cents countered at 9. Harlan bid 10 without hesitating. The man near the back wall made a face like he'd smelled something and shook his head. The auctioneer looked around the ring once more in the way auctioneers do when they're giving the room one last chance, and then said sold in the flat. Procedural tone of a man who has already moved on to lot 23 in his mind. 90 head. Average weight 531 pounds per the intake sheet. 10 cents a pound worked out to $4,779. Harlan paid $410 from his wallet at the ticket window and called his father from the parking lot. His father listened on the phone without interrupting. When Harlan finished explaining, there was a pause. Then his father said, "You checked them the way Cecil said." It wasn't really a question. Harlan said he had. His father said he'd have the balance ready Monday morning and that he'd try to get off early to help haul. They loaded the calves that evening in 2 runs using a borrowed Wilson livestock trailer, a 1998 model that belonged to a neighbor named Bud Fenter, who had sold his own cattle the year before and didn't need it at the moment. It took until just past 9 o'clock to get all 90 heads settled on the clean fescue and orchard grass pasture that Harlan's father had been resting since the 1st of July. They put out fresh water in 3 tanks and left them alone. The next morning, Harlan called Dr. Hines, a large animal veterinarian out of Bowling Green who had worked with the Goss family for years. Dr. Hines came out that Saturday afternoon, walked the pen slowly, checked temperatures on a sample of 12 animals, and confirmed what Harlan had suspected. Early-stage bird, widespread through the pen. Not yet critical in most animals. They worked all 90 head that afternoon, tulathromycin, dosed by weight every animal. It took 3 hours. When they were done, Harlan's arms ached from the headgate work, and Dr. Hines said the first 72 hours would tell a great deal. Harlan stayed close to the pasture for the next 4 days. He walked it morning and evening, looking at the same things Cecil had told him to look for. He pulled 3 animals that got worse and put them in a separate pen for secondary treatment. He lost one of those 3 on day 6, a heifer that had been further along than he'd assessed, he believed, though he couldn't be entirely certain. He lost 5 more over the following 10 days, all from the group of 8 he'd marked with a question mark on his legal pad. 6 total. He had planned for 8. He lost 6. The bird outbreak that hit Pike County in the 2nd and 3rd weeks of November 2009 was one of the harder ones in recent county memory. It came through stalker operations across the county and into Monroe and Rawls counties to the west, working through calves that had shipped in from the same northern Missouri and southern Iowa pipeline in late October and early November. A man named Dennis Claycomb, who ran a backgrounding yard 6 miles northeast of the Goss farm and who had received 200 head of fresh calves the week before the sale, lost 31 animals between November 10th and November 23rd. He had treated them, but late, 4 days after they started showing symptoms, which was about 3 days longer than the window Cecil Pruitt had described in his index cards. Another operation north of Bowling Green lost 18 head. The county extension agent made 4 farm calls in less than a week. None of those calls went to the Goss farm. The 84 surviving calves came through November and into December on the rested pasture, gaining slowly at first and then more steadily as the disease cleared and their appetites returned. The first 2 weeks after treatment were the hardest to watch. The calves were still coughing, still dull in their movement, and there were mornings when Harlan walked the fence line in the gray November cold and had to remind himself that improvement at this stage was measured in small things, not obvious things. A calf eating that hadn't eaten the day before. A calf that had been standing at the back of the pen now standing at the front. The coughing getting wetter and more productive, which Cecil had said was a good sign, not a bad one. It meant the animal was clearing, not drowning. By the 3rd week of December, the pen sounded different. Still not quiet. Stalker calves are never especially quiet. But the coughing had mostly stopped. And the animals were moving around the pasture with something that looked, for the first time, like ordinary hunger rather than sick animal restlessness. Harlan's father started supplementing with a round bale of good mixed hay every few days through January, keeping them on a slow, consistent gain rather than trying to push weight fast. That had been in Cecil's notes too. Don't stress a recovered animal back into illness by overfeeding too early. Harlan weighed a sample group in January, 12 head, chosen to represent the range of the pen, and the numbers were right. He weighed the whole pen in March and was more than satisfied. By late April, when he ran them across the scale at the Pike County barn for the final time, they averaged 662 pounds. A gain of roughly 130 pounds each over 5.5 months, which was not remarkable for healthy calves on good ground, but was close to remarkable for calves that had been bought sick off a flagged pen in November. He sold them the first Friday of May at 91 cents a pound. 84 head, 662 pounds average. The gross came to $50,594. His total costs, adding up purchase price, veterinary bills, supplemental feed, hauling, and a share of winter hay, came to $14,380. He was 16 years old. His net was $36,214. Merle Ashcraft heard the numbers through the barn about 3 weeks after the sale. He heard them from the auctioneer, Gerald Hobbs, who had heard them from Harlan's father, who had mentioned it without particular fanfare while consigning a group of cows in early June. Merle said he wasn't surprised. Exactly. He said what had stayed with him was that Friday in November, the 41 minutes at the gate. The legal pad, the way the boy had bid without looking around for reassurance from anyone. He said in 38 years of buying cattle, he had never stood at a sick pen for 41 minutes himself. He didn't know why not. He said maybe that was the answer right there. Roy Fenner found Harlan at the barn that summer and asked him straight out what he had seen that he hadn't. Harlan told him about Cecil Pruitt, about the index cards, about reading the calves instead of the gate tag. Fenner listened without interrupting, which was not his usual habit. When Harlan finished, Fenner nodded slowly and said he'd bought and sold cattle for 32 years and he wasn't sure he'd ever spent more than 30 seconds at a flagged pen before walking on. He said he didn't know if he could have made himself stand there for 41 minutes. He said he meant that as a plain fact, not a compliment. Harlan told him it helped to know what you were looking for. Cecil Pruitt had no way of knowing any part of this was coming. He had spent the last years of his active life on a small operation that had wound down to nothing, keeping index cards that nobody had asked for, about cattle decisions that nobody else was going to face in exactly the way he'd faced them. He wrote them because he thought observation was worth recording, and because it seemed wrong to let what he'd learned just go dark when he did. He gave the cards to a 13-year-old boy because the boy asked real questions and seemed to want the real answers, and that was enough of a reason. The index cards are in a tin box on a shelf in the Goss equipment shed now. Harlan has started his own notebook, a standard composition book, the black and white kind, that he began in the spring of 2010. He is on his 4th one. He does not think this is a remarkable thing to do. He thinks it's just what you do if you want to know something well enough to act on it when the moment is short and the room is not on your side. 60 buyers in that barn that Friday. Every one of them had years on Harlan Goss. Not one of them stood at that pen for 41 minutes. Not one of them read the calves. He had a legal pad, a borrowed trailer, and 60 index cards from a dead man who had paid attention. That was the whole of it.